Hi everyone, welcome to the MBN Boston Data Podcast. This episode, our topic is Gen AI and data migration platforms. Today, we're excited to welcome Rob Whiffin. Rob is a senior solutions architect at Databricks. With over 12 years, Rob's worked for companies such as Celerity, Karmarama, SKY, Hotels.com. He's worked as an Insight Analyst, data scientist, and data ops engineering professional. In this episode, Rob will explore how Gen AI can improve migrations today and significantly change how they will be done tomorrow. He will cover topics such as why companies do migrations and common problems, how Gen AI's unique features can change an approach, and why this is a good use case for organizations to get started within Gen AI. Rob, many thanks for joining us today. I know we've known each other for quite some time. Probably placed you back in 2011 at Karmarama as an Insight Analyst. So it's been a long time coming, this one. Look, for the benefit of the audience, I know I've made a quick introduction, but could you tell us your story, where you come from, your journey in data so far, and what you're doing right now?
Certainly. And look, thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. So I've had quite an unusual career journey into data, right? Like when I went to university, I thought I was actually going to be a vet, and I started doing my first degree was actually in something called bioveterinary science because I thought I was going to be a vet. Didn't work hard enough to get the grades to go to vet school though. And then I actually sort of pivoted and thought, well, maybe I enjoy the science side more than I enjoy the veterinary side. So I actually went and did a master's in biomedical research, and they thought, oh, well, maybe there's a PhD in my future. And I quite enjoy this science lark. And then changed my mind after that because actually I enjoy having a bit more money than a life in academia I think it is going to provide. So I then kind of fell into data, really. It was basically the first job that came along, which was working with a tool called FastStats in CRM analytics. And I spent 4 or 5 years, I think, doing different marketing roles, all of the kind of insight analyst type of things. And that was where I got my first taste, I suppose, of working with data, with code. I learned to write SQL there, for example. And it was okay, but it wasn't the most exciting of roles. And then I had what can only really be described as a lucky redundancy at the same time as data science was beginning to be a thing. Right, the data science jobs were starting to come out, and I got a redundancy, and I decided to put that money. I was lucky enough to still be living at home, so I put that money into a master's in business analytics at Imperial Business School, and thought, well, maybe there's a career in data science for me here. So that led to a job at Hotels.com as a data scientist. And I did that for a few years, and I thought, actually, this isn't really for me. This is a bit too much focused on the maths and the stats and trying to inch that number ever so slightly higher, that I thought, I'm more interested in both the people side and the outcomes, like the business side, like what's the impact this is having, rather than just chasing that number and trying to get that higher. Plus, I was never really that good at the maths and the stats in the first place. So that led to another job where I was more customer facing, and then ultimately it has led to me working at Databricks, where I now spend my time talking about data as a whole rather than really, focusing on specific models. I talk to customers all about how they can help get value out of their data, how Databricks can help them get value out of that. So it's been quite a varied journey, really. Like I've been working in data, but that's such a broad topic. Now it's like I've been hands-on writing code 8 hours a day, and now I spend most of my time talking to people, and seemingly people want to hear what I have to say, which is a constant surprise, I have to say.
Yeah, well, it's good. It's really good to see. I mean, like I said, we've probably not spoken, obviously, since the last few weeks, probably for the best part of 9-10 years, on and off. Now and again, I've sent you a message to say how you're getting on and vice versa. But to see your career trajectory, it's really good to see. It's obviously great to see how you've transitioned from insight analytics, customer insight, to then data science, and then further forward as well too. So I know you've kind of worked in many facets in the data space as well, and it's quite an exciting time right now too. And I'm sure, based on the conversation we're going to have right now, I'm sure it will change again very soon. So let's get to it. So in terms of obviously the topic at hand, I was keen to discuss what the key challenges are with companies currently facing data platform migrations, and in your opinion, how can Gen AI help address them?
Certainly. So look, this is informed by my day job, right? So Databricks is it is a data platform. It's a place where companies can do all of their data workloads. And so one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking to customers about is how they can migrate off of their legacy systems onto Databricks. And the problems that almost every company under the sun has when it comes to getting off of a legacy system, they're not new problems, and they're surprisingly common across all of them. And they can probably be boiled down, I think, into maybe 2 or 3 broad categories. Now, the first one is, especially for older companies, is there's a lot of legacy code running in production. Right? There's a lot of stuff that's been written 20 years ago. The original requirements have long since been lost. The original author has long since moved on. The code's been touched 100 times since then. And there's stuff running that no one really knows what it does. As an example here, someone once mentioned to me, I think it was an SAP system that had 70,000 scripts running in production, 7,500 running on any given day. And basically no one knew. Like the 2 DBAs that knew what were going on had both left, and no one knew what was actually happening in this thing. So this obviously creates quite a lot of fear. Right? It's you've got this stuff running in your production environment, but you don't know what it's doing. You don't know what it's doing, and therefore you don't know how important it is, and you don't know whether what the impact of touching this is. So this is one of the biggies, right? Is this sort of fear of the unknown, effectively. And this leads on to quite a lot of other concerns. But the other big problem that we see is just that migrations are not exciting projects, right? They're certainly valuable projects. They can deliver a lot of business value by deprecating old hardware, moving to more modern, cost-effective solutions, opening up new tools. I mean, you can't do a Gen AI sort of use case on SQL Server, right? It's if you want to take advantage of the latest and greatest, you need to be on a tool that's capable of doing it. But so there's clearly a lot of value attached to a migration, but they are fairly humdrum projects. These are not things that can be used to attract talent. These are not things that can be used to shout from the rooftops about how cool your company is. So those are, I think, 2 of the big ones. There's this fear of basically moving something that is potentially very important to your business, and there's a dead certain chance that some of what is running in there is important because it's obviously your production environment. And then there's the talent side of it, because a migration is not a short project. It's going to take several years before there's a payoff on it, which means that that's several years where you've got to try and keep people interested in doing this. So I think those are the 2 biggies. Now, how do I think that Gen AI can help with those? On the first side, around the sort of explaining what is going on. Now, this is where I think all of internet models that we see, the likes of OpenAI, Meta, Anthropic, all the big open models, coming into play, actually have a really good advantage because they've been trained on the entire internet. You can kind of view them as, as basically a big database of the internet. Right, so if a language or a system has public documentation, there's a very good chance that these models actually have that documentation inside of them. As an example of this, if you think about SAP, for instance, it's got a famously obscure sort of schemas and column names. If you ask ChatGPT, what does this column do? Where does this column come from in SAP? And you give it one of those random strings, it will tell you where it's from, what data it contains, what it's commonly used for. Right. So this is a good little sort of data point of how you can use these things, because this means that they can actually be used to explain the mechanics of what a bit of code is doing. Right. So because they've basically been trained on the documentation of these systems, and there's not necessarily a direct correlation, I think, between the age of the system and the amount of data online for it. Because if you think about really old systems, it's probably not that much. But certainly the more popular a system is, there's a good chance the more data is online on it. So they can explain mechanically what a bit of code is doing. And there's value in that, because the first step to understanding what a bit of code is doing is actually, the mechanics of it. So this code is selecting from this table, it's joining to this other table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's only one part of the problem, right? There's the second part. It's what's the semantic understanding? What does this code actually mean for your business? What is the output that it's producing? How is that likely to be used? And this is where LLM's ability to integrate basically ad hoc data, like your personal business context information, comes into play. If I think about, say, a retailer, for instance, they might be producing, I don't know, a set of summaries on a per store region. That's going to be, the code will tell you this is selecting this data, it's aggregating it, it's ordering it, it's ranking it. Okay, that's useful. That will help me when I need to write some new code. It doesn't help me understand what it's for. It doesn't help me understand if this is important, if this needs to be migrated, if I can actually leave this, because it's not really that big a deal. It's easier to rewrite something in the new system, for instance. So that's how they can help, I think, on the first point, on that legacy code understanding. Now, I think they can help even more in terms of actually making migration something that you can use as a way of attracting and retaining talent. Because if you can turn your migration from like a sausage factory where we're just going to turn the wheel and we're just going to do one pipeline after another, we've got it down and basically, sit down, I figure this bit out, I write some code, I figure this bit out, I put it into a code translator, blah, blah, blah. If you can turn this into a research project, then all of a sudden you've got the opportunities to stand up and do podcasts about it. You've got the opportunity to stand up and do blogs about it. People will want to hear how you have used this new and shiny tool to accelerate a very important business project.
Yeah, definitely. And I think from my perspective too, when you're selling an organization on a data migration project, it can be 50-50 whether or not an individual is interested, usually based on the technology and tools getting used. If they want to do that, it's kind of like a use case for them. Sometimes they want to be given the opportunity to build it themselves. It'll be part of a team that does that. But some individuals don't. They want something out of the box that they can work on straight away. And there's no right or wrong there too as well. But I think with what you're saying, there's definitely techniques and ways, like you discussed just then, in regards to attraction in that space. And I think it will be, in very, very soon, it'll be a lot more, I don't think it'll be a problem. But you mentioned LLMs as well too. And that did go on to my next question. In your opinion, how do LLMs provide transparency for legacy code, and why is this critical for successful migrations?
So I think the way that they can provide transparency is twofold, as I mentioned previously, right? Is that one is because these models have been trained on all of the internet, they basically have everything that is publicly available to anyone really to go and search should be in their training data, or at least there's a good chance it's in their training data. So this means that you can stick a bit of code into one of these things and ask it, what does this code do? And there's a good chance that it's going to come back with the right answer. And anecdotally, this is what we have found working in Databricks. Now, proving this, getting a quantitative answer is quite a bit harder, because I think you could ask 3 people, what does this bit of code do? And you're going to get 3 different answers back. So there's certainly there's definitely a metrics question around this, but anecdotally they're surprisingly good at providing a mechanistic explanation of it, which is what you'd expect. Right? And by mechanistic, I mean this statement is selecting data from this table, it's joining it onto these, it's aggregating it, it's reshaping, blah 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 blah. So there is a lot of value, I think, in being able to do that explanation at scale across an entire code base, because the first part, in order for a human to sit down and move a bit of code over, they've got to figure out what it's doing, and that can be quite a slow process. It's quite a lot of time involved in actually reading through a bit of script, especially when it's something thousands of lines long, and figuring out what it's doing. But where that gets interesting then is figuring out the why is this important. Where it gets interesting is figuring out how this mechanistic explanation ties in with the business context. And this is where the kind of prompt engineering ability with LLMs gets really exciting, because you can take this is a bit of Teradata code, I want you to migrate this into PySpark or something like that, but then you can start adding in, and we're a retail business, this has come from our ERP system or something like that, so that you can then start adding in that context and start asking the LLM to produce explanations around how might this data be used, what might be the risk of if this goes wrong, for instance, what kind of business processes might be tied off of this. Now, why is this useful for a migration? This is a very cheap way of trying to get this information. Right? These models are They're expensive to use at very high volumes, but we're not talking high throughputs here. It's like once a bit of code has been through it, then it's done. So this is quite a cheap way of doing this, because this is also a highly scalable way of doing this. You can chuck all of your code at an LLM and get the responses back in the space of like a day or something. So this is not something that requires requires sticking a whole bunch of people on it and waiting 6 months for them to come back. Now, once you've got that understanding, then I described sort of one of the big problems, the first problems that you asked about, as like a fear of the unknown. So if you think that if fear of the unknown is part of the problem, and then that's what we're trying to solve for here, is effectively opening up that black box, then creating that understanding, especially if you create that sort of semantic understanding, not just the mechanistic, goes a long way to alleviating those concerns, because you know now what the code is doing. Now, you've got an explanation. You can start doing some analytics and some research on top of that. But you can then take this in a bit further, because once you've got that understanding, you can then start asking questions like, well, what is the criticality of this to my business? There's clearly a difference between a script which produces something for a Power BI report that gets looked at occasionally versus something that's updating your customer information. If one of those goes wrong, your business potentially gets in a lot of trouble. If the other one goes wrong, okay, an analyst maybe gets an email from a boss or something saying my numbers are wrong, or you need to double check it. I've been there. So there's clearly a degree in importance here. And how, again, it comes back to that like scalable approach. How can you try and figure out, when you've got tens of thousands of scripts in production, it is not feasible to check all of them. Like, it's just impossible, basically, or to do it manually. So you need a scalable approach to that. Now, my final point on this one then is that I think this is where the Gen AI tools become really quite interesting, because there are lots of deterministic code translators out there. Right, you can put code in and they will translate it line by line and you get some new code out. And that's great. But the one thing that they cannot do is provide any kind of semantic explanation, because that's not what they're built for. So this is the USP for a Gen AI based migration.
Okay, yeah, I think it does move into my next question as well too, and it's more about organisations that probably have done platform migrations previously, or organisations that maybe have done it for the first time too. So I think it still applies for both. But what makes platform migrations an ideal starting point for companies adopting Gen AI? Is there a benefit in that context?
So yes, there is, or at least I think there is. And this really comes down to risk, right? Which is, Gen AI is still, if you think what GPT-4 sort of came out, I don't know what, like just over 2 years ago, something like that. So it's still quite a new technology. Organizations are still figuring out how to do this. There have certainly been some high-profile instances of where these models have gone rogue, for lack of a better word. There's a sort of famous Air Canada example where a chatbot basically said to a passenger it could have a refund when it shouldn't have done, and the court ruled that no, the company had to honour that. It was the same as a person saying it. So that's clearly having a financial implication. Mm-hmm. If you think about when, say, Microsoft released a Twitter bot, back when we were in the days of Twitter, and how that went wrong. Even Google is not immune to this. When it released, I think it was Gemini, when that first came out, that had some very well publicized issues going on. So these models are powerful, but they are risky. Now, why does this make a migration a good case for this? Because a migration is, from a company perspective, a purely internal use case. Right? There is no public facing aspect to this. You're changing your back-end systems. So you don't need to worry about a model spitting out something inappropriate, something not safe for work, because it's not going to make it into the public domain. So that's a big part of it, is that these are internal things. The second part of that is there is a clear, what does good look like? There is a clear good answer to this. It's like, does the code run and does it produce the same answers? Yes, in that case, it's good. If it doesn't, No, there's clearly some more work to be done. So that is a way of reducing the risk of the fact that these models are generative. They are probabilistic, right? So there's no guarantee that you're going to get the same answer twice. So how do you guarantee that you're getting the right answer? Well, you've got the right answer because you know it should be doing the same as the old stuff. Okay, maybe it needs to do it in a better way, a different way, but ultimately, if the old stuff is giving you an answer of 100 and the new stuff is giving you an answer of 200, something has gone wrong. Something needs to be looked at. So you've got two complementary aspects here. You've got one, the reputational risk, the public sort of public-facing nature of these models' risk is completely mitigated because this is not a public-facing use case. Second side is, how do I know that it's giving me the right answer? Because you've got a ground truth to check it against. So that means that this is a really good opportunity for an organization to create the startup, to sort of seed rather their like AI lab, if you will, because you can stick a data scientist or two working on this as a project, and the business value, like your ROI here should be undoubtable, because you're not doing a migration just for a little bit, right? It should be a huge strategic project which is going to deliver lots and lots of value. So if you can accelerate that by, say, 6 months to a year, then you will have delivered significant value there. So you can put a couple of people working on this in low risk. They don't need advanced skills. You don't need to hire a couple of PhD LLM experts with this. Like, ultimately, this is something that starts off with just prompt engineering. Mm-hmm. Do you know your source system? Do you know your target system? Excellent, you're good to go. And you can build up your AI skills. You can learn what are the pitfalls of deploying these models in production. What are the guardrails that I need to put in? What are the things that what are the things that you don't know that are going to come up, that are going to come and bite you, basically? You can learn those in a safe space. That's why I think this is a good first use case for Gen AI in a company.
Yeah, what I like about that too, as well, is that you can use your existing data science, engineering, analytics team to potentially become specialists within your organization for this case as well. And like you said, you don't need to go back to the market to find specifically focused individuals for this specific use case. So it's good. And like we talked before about your career, it's leveling up data scientists and data professionals to maybe move more into that space as well too of Gen AI, so then they can become a specialist out of experience and maybe not just education as well too. So it's good. That's really good to hear. I do want to hammer down slightly on the Gen AI specific questions with you right now. Probably more out of my interest as well too, and I can learn a thing or two from this. But in terms of Gen AI, we talked about it slightly, but how do you think it improves code translation and optimization during migration processes?
So yeah, that's a good question. And I think this really comes from these models' ability to synthesize different sources of information at the same time. Now, as an example here, right, what I've seen work in some of my projects at Databricks is the ability for an LLM to take a bit of SQL and produce an improved version of a bit of SQL. Now, what do I just to break that down a bit more? When you're translating, right, translation, sort of strictly speaking, I guess, is what is the equivalent of this code in this language. Right. Now, that's generally not the way that you want to do your platform migration. Your platform migration is an opportunity to improve things. And indeed, what we actually see at Databricks, and I'm sure this is common across the world, right, is that if you do a lift and shift from a legacy system to a new system, the stuff that was optimized to run on the old system is no longer optimal to run on the old system. And indeed, in some cases, it may very well be suboptimal, maybe be quite bad. So what this can lead to is that your migration process looks like this, right? You do a bunch of time, so you spend that long moving code over. Great, it's all done. You then find that you're spending a hell of a lot of money on your new system because you've just ported over a load of code that isn't designed to run on the new system. So you then need to spend this much time again basically optimizing it and getting it work. So this delays your time to value for the migration, right? Means that the migration is going to take an extra few years or something in order to start paying returns. So if you can shift that so that rather than doing a lift and shift where you're basically, translate what is the equivalent of A in this language, in my new language, to how should this code be running on my new system. Right? It's a slight tweak it's a tweak in the thought process here, which is I'm not after you to translate this code anymore. Instead, I want you to write. This is where having a good explanation and a good understanding of the intent of the code comes in, because this then changes the question to write some new code to do this on this new system. And that way you can say in your sort of prompt, for instance, I need you to take full advantage of all of the benefits that PySpark has, that Delta Lake has, that whatever your target system has. And this then allows you to do, rather than a lift and shift, kind of like a move and improve approach to your migration. So as a concrete example, then using, I can't remember which model it was, but I gave a insert, update, delete set of statements in SQL as the input. So this is 3 distinct statements, and this is how SQL Server works. But Spark and Delta Lake has a command called merge, which lets you do this in a single command. So it allows you to go from three statements down to 1, right? That's an optimization there. Also means it runs a bit faster in Spark and Delta Lake. And you are quite easily able to prompt the LLM to take that insert, update, delete and produce that merge statement. Doesn't require any expert knowledge. You don't need to know the inner workings of Spark or of Delta Lake or of SQL Server for that matter. It just does it. So this actually highlights how easy it can be to shift from copy and paste, if you will, lift and shift, translate A to B, A to A, to give me A to, I don't know, A prime, for instance. What's the best version of this to run on our platform?
Just specifically in regards to what Databricks do as an organization as well, and I think a lot of our listeners are very much interested. You're all over the place right now. You can't miss Databricks on LinkedIn, and they're at the forefront of this specific industry right now, especially within Gen AI. I did want to jump slightly into some of the tools that Databricks use, and you might be using as well too, or working with. So what types of tools or roles do Databricks use right now in terms of migration framework, and how does that leverage Gen AI?
So we recently announced, I think it was a couple of months ago, a project called Legion, which is a migration framework, and I use that word intentionally, right? Legion is not a migration tool that will do your migration for you out of the box. This is a framework for you to build on. So this comes back to your previous question around why should you use this? Well, sorry, why should this be a good first project for you? And Legion is part of the Databricks tooling, which is designed to kind of accelerate that first project for you. So it provides a nice interface and a set of tools, a nice setup process to actually get started with putting some code in, start building these prompts, and start actually getting some outputs. Hopefully, in a nice, user-friendly and intuitive way. Now, the reason where the name comes from is it's actually biblical. The idea is that this is an agentic AI framework. Right, is that there's going to be lots of different AI agents. So I spoke previously about how we've already got, say, a need for explanation and translation, basically explaining what the code is doing and then trying to do that, optimize that move as well, potentially with the optimization as well. But we can extend that to think about, analyzing the risk or assigning a risk score to a bit of code. I think I mentioned that previously. We can then change that, perhaps reframe that into does this code need to be migrated? Not all code needs to be migrated. Right? That's one of the big things in a migration is figuring out what does and doesn't need to be moved. So you can start figuring out that as well. You can then start turning this into, especially if you start thinking outside the realms of SQL migrations, into if you're looking at, say, legacy code, I don't know, like Fortran or COBOL or Pascal, it's only boilerplate that can just be stripped out. So what am I migrating this to? Can we just start stripping stuff out? Can we start just making this better? So this is where the agentic AI framework comes in, is what we want to see here is lots of different AI agents all being called. And the latest LLMs have obviously got tool use capabilities. So this is where this starts to get really exciting, is we can start integrating arbitrary tools to start doing interesting stuff and have basically a network of AI agents talking to each other. That's certainly the vision for Databricks Legion. Now, as a framework, Legion is obviously it's built from Databricks. It's built to help customers move to Databricks, but it is AI agnostic. Now, by that, what I mean is it doesn't matter you have complete choice over which LLM that you use in order to help you with this, or which LLMs. You can use multiple if you so choose. Why is this good? Because, a big part of Databricks' philosophy, right, is you shouldn't be tightly coupled with your LLM. You should be free to switch between the best models. If we think like Amazon recently, what was it, like 2 weeks ago or something, announced their Nova set of models. There's a new GPT model in preview. I'm sure that Meta will have something new coming out in the next few months as well. Like, this space is advancing very quickly. And if you tie yourself into one, no good. That's not a sensible strategy, right? You're much better having a strategy of flexibility when it comes to your tool choice. So because this is an AI agnostic framework that you can plug into, this means that if you are, I don't know, maybe you are restricted maybe you're an Amazon shop, for instance, and you can't use OpenAI. It's against policy or whatever. Well, now you can use Nova. Or perhaps you have security concerns around running any proprietary model, and therefore you're restricted to open source models only, running in your private infrastructure on your cloud, for instance. Or in that case, you can use Llama, or you can use something else. Sorry, Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, well, I appreciate that. In regards to risk, you mentioned risk, right? And this is something that's popping up quite a lot with the clients I work with, specifically when it comes to security and slightly governance as well too. I know it's slightly different than security, but it pops up in the same conversation quite a lot. What I'm keen to find out is how companies balance the use of AI in platform migrations while addressing security concerns around things like public-facing models. So obviously that is a concern right now, and there's a lot of pieces in the market right now discussing this and the pitfalls in that space right now.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I think a lot of this is addressed, I suppose, by paperwork, for lack of a better word. I mean, I think I know sort of our OpenAI obviously has the guarantees in its paperwork. It's not going to, you can opt out of it using your data, for instance. But ultimately, if you are sending data, and that data in this case is your code, right? And that code, as I said before, is a formalized expression of your business logic. It's like your code should be viewed as some of your most sensitive IP, because if someone were to get that code, they could basically figure out how your business runs, how you make decisions, what kind of questions you're asking of your data. Like, it's very sensitive information. And if you are sending that somewhere else, you are fundamentally letting that out of your site. Right. But I don't think that's too much of a concern. I think we're all used to using external services now. I think there's plenty around that. So the bigger one, I think, is probably around is going to be around customization. Yeah, security is definitely a big deal, but I think the bigger question when it comes to choosing your AI model is around the ability to customize it. Because I mentioned previously around how this as an AI sort of sandbox project allows you to start small and then grow in complexity. And Legion is a great way to get started with this. And it does have that full capabilities for you to start small with what is just prompt engineering. And so prompt engineering, for those not aware, is basically like writing English. You're writing the input into the models. So yes, there's some excellent courses online. I know Google's got a free prompt engineering course. There's certainly a skill to it, but it's a very accessible skill, because if you can write, you can learn to do prompt engineering, basically. And hopefully, if you're working in data, you know how to write. So that should be that makes this very accessible. But where this gets interesting is when we start thinking about how do we scale that in complexity. So we might want to think about, for instance, fine tuning an open source model or a proprietary model. You can do either. It's just easier to do an open source model. So you might think about fine tuning an open source model. If I go back to my previous example where they've got 70,000 odd scripts running in prod, you might want to take a couple of hundred of those and do some manual work and then look at fine-tuning a model to produce an output that is best for your business on your data. And then ultimately you might want to go all the way and then potentially think about maybe building something bespoke.
Yeah, definitely. I was just saying that it's funny that you mentioned prompt engineering courses. I definitely think I need to take one as a recruiter as well too. I'm seeing a lot of memes on Instagram and whatnot, showing people just bullying ChatGPT, making things shorter. And I think it is due to the user error as well too. I think if you know how to actually train these OpenAI, for instance, to get what you need, you don't have to continuously keep asking it the same thing over and over again. So I know that's a basic example, but it is useful for everyone, not even just data professionals.
Well, it ties back to your point as well. Like something when we were saying about how it can this is a way to make a migration sexy, right, and attract talent. But also, Gen AI is clearly like I don't think anyone thinks that this is going to go away. Like this is not a flash in the pan, and in a couple of years we're going to look back and say, "Oh, do you remember those LLMs that we all had?" It's like these things are here to stay. I think we are still figuring out how to use them. I think we're still waiting for like the killer use case to come back. I mean, Copilot is as annoying as it is useful in equal measure, I find, for example. But we all need to figure out how to work with these things. And you mentioned around our, like data engineers, data scientists, data analysts. It's like everyone needs a way to do this. And the first step into that is prompt engineering. But I guess this comes back to like not so much around security, but around risk, right? Which is that people need to do that in an area that is both safe for the business, safe for them, and ideally where you've got that you need to have confidence in the output. I think this is one of the biggest challenges for me at least, when it comes to using LLM assistants, is they're so confident in their response, but sometimes they're so wrong in their response. And if you don't know what the answer should be, it could be feeding you complete gibberish, and you're going to go and recite that. However, in the context of a migration, you know to some degree what the source system is, like what it's doing. You certainly know what you want the output to be. So it provides quite a safe space, for lack of a better word, in terms of building these skills.
Yeah, I'm already seeing an impact, probably negatively, in my field, where when a CV is written in ChatGPT, when it's getting used in that capacity. And it's very cookie cutter as well too. So I'm really, by all means, use it. It's great. It picks up things, and might shorten things down as well too, and make it more succinct. But write it yourself. Use it as a template. Don't just feed it through and then copy and paste, because that's where we're seeing just basically the same CVs.
Well, and this is where
it doesn't realise. As an individual, you're not going to get your personality from it. You need to do things like that yourself. And I think that's where, from a data perspective as well too, the human interaction element is absolutely, you can't just leave this thing to run itself. I'm sure you know that, and you've had examples of that too. So,
well, this is where like the importance of a validation framework comes in. Like if you think I spoke previously around how this is a scalable approach, how scalable these tools are, and how that is useful in the context of a migration. It's yes, 100% that is, but that comes with the caveat of you need to have confidence in the answers that it's giving you, because you will get an answer out of an LLM, right? Like everyone knows that. The question is it the right answer? Yeah. So how do you go about figuring that out? You need that validation framework. This is something that's going to be coming in the next release of Legion early next year, actually, is basically like taking in some sort of ground truth and using that to assess your prompts against. Because if you've got that sort of ground truth and you think, well, hold on a minute, this is getting me like 90% accuracy, 80% accuracy, for instance, you can then start rolling that out at scale across your code base. Because if you don't have that, then you've basically got something that's producing an output. Whoop-de-doo. How do you know whether it's worth using or not? So you need to have that validation. And that in itself opens up quite an interesting set of consideration points, because how do you at scale validate that the code is being produced is being correct? Right? You can you can easily check it whether it's syntactically correct, which is good, but it doesn't mean necessarily that it's doing the right thing. Right? The code may compile, it may run. That doesn't mean that it's producing the right answer. Clearly, the gold standard is going to be run the returned code and see if it produces the same number as the input code. But that's not necessarily a scalable solution, because that means that you might have to run tens of thousands of scripts all at once, or at least over a short period of time. So that's going to be the gold standard. But ideally, you want to have a bit more. You want to have a degree of confidence with something without having to run every single script. These are some of the challenges that we've been wrestling with recently as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's the way I see it from a non-technical perspective. It's only as good as the people behind it that are using it. So it's that simple, really, in my opinion. But I wanted to go back on track in terms of business impact of Gen AI into migration efforts as well too. And obviously, not everyone, like we've been discussing, is going to be a data professional who's going to be using Gen AI, and there's obviously going to be senior execs, directors, stakeholders that will need to see some sort of impact of it as well too, positively. So again, I'm keen to explore how businesses can measure ROIs of integrating Gen AI into their migration efforts.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it needs a slight bit of reframing, right? Which the value isn't necessarily in integrating Gen AI, right? The value is in the outcome that it drives. So I think how do you measure that is the question. How do you measure if your migration is being accelerated? Like if that's the kind of the pitch, the dream, that this is going to make your migration process faster and cheaper, then how do you measure that? Because then it's almost like a counterfactual. So, okay, maybe you could have a team running in parallel to, let's say you've got your migration process going on, you've got your partner involved, they've put a lot of people on there, they're churning through, going through file by file, and they've got their tools and they're doing it. Great. Maybe you can then actually say, right, we're this data warehouse, for instance, and its associated code, this is going to be migrated by my data science team, and they're going to use Gen AI. I know it's taken 6 months for the partner to do this. They're going to get to this eventually. So let's give it to the data scientists. Let's give it to this research project, and let's see how they can do. What's their output look like? Because that's going to give you a bit of a benchmark here for did they do a good job? Did it work? Did they say, okay, maybe they only got like 80% accuracy, for instance, but they did it in 3 weeks, whereas the other guys weren't going to get to it for a year. And now I suppose this comes back to it, say, well, you can now focus that more valuable human effort on the bits that it didn't do very well on, but it's done all the easy stuff in basically no time at all, for instance. Now, so I think that's one way to go around that. The harder, if not impossible, part to measure is going to be the intangibles. I said like previously around how this is a good project to start learning those Gen AI skills. So I don't think it's an unfair assumption to say that most organizations are going to need to figure out how to use Gen AI. And if they don't, they're going to be left behind. Like, I do think there's something to be said for the idea that you're not going to lose your job to an AI, you're going to lose your job to someone who is using it, who's learned how to be more efficient with it. And that's going to be the same for companies. Companies aren't going to be taken out of the market. They're not going to be replaced by an AI tool. They're going to be replaced. They're going to be outcompeted by companies that have figured out how to use AI and how to integrate AI. So how do you measure those intangibles of you need to get started on this? If you don't get started now, you are potentially falling behind your competition. And I guess that is, I don't know, it'd be interesting. It's maybe things like staff retention. I don't know how you go about measuring those things, if you can measure them. But I don't think anyone would say they're not important. I mean, there's the book, the original book that publicized OKRs was called Measure What Matters. Right? And I'm a big believer in that. It's very easy to put KPIs in front of things just to show a metric and show a number going up. Doesn't mean you're measuring the right thing. And I equally believe that not everything important can be measured.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there from a recruitment perspective. KPIs, not a fan at all after 13 years in talent. But I mean, who do you think's doing this well then in terms of organisations that have successfully used GenAI for platform? No one.
No, this is too new. So there are several startups out there that are selling basically what Databricks has built in Legion as a paid for tool. I am sure that they are wonderful and very good, given that Databricks has built something in its field engineering free time. But clearly that comes with a cost. There are, I think, every migration partner under the sun has a Gen AI tool in there. But I think everyone is still figuring out how to actually use these at scale.
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting to hear. I wanted to move swiftly and briefly onto just a talent and skills perspective as well too. From my perception right now, we're obviously receiving and partnering, receiving a lot of more AI focused, Gen AI focused vacancies. Some of them could be a director of AI or an AI engineer, for instance. So it's on the rise. And we're navigating that with our clients as well too, to varying degrees of success. And it's usually dependent on what the client might need, but what the client wants as well too. So in my personal opinion, I'm seeing the advent again of unicorn wish list requirements for these types of roles, very similar to back in 2013, 2014 with data scientists, where there was you want a data scientist and an engineer in one role, and it took a few years for it to actually separate effectively, and the wider market to understand the differences and the uniqueness of the roles. So how does growing demand for Gen AI skills impact the hiring market within a legacy system environment as well too?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think what we will see here is the importance of programmers with legacy skills. Like trying to hire someone with COBOL skills or Pascal or Fortran. Right? There's not that many people out there. There's certainly very few people, if any, coming out of university with those skills. So I think where we will see Gen AI start to be useful in those is that then I suppose this comes back to like the AI engineer, right? Is that we don't need to hire people with those skills. We need to hire people that are capable of writing prompts and figuring out how to actually get these models to produce an accurate output of those. So yeah, I think that's where it's going to go. I think one of the things that I'm kind of seeing is we all need to learn how to use Gen AI, but what we're going to see here, right, or at least in my opinion, is that AI is going to allow us to concentrate more on what humans are good at, rather than doing stuff that can be done by a machine. So, like, how do you do sort of like the value side, for instance? How do you start explaining the value of what you're doing to someone? How do you have those personal skills? I think we're going to see people that we're going to see an increase or a demand rather for people that are able to do both.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is, in my opinion, that has been the case over the last several years, where it's all fine and well, being a really good coder and, coming from a fantastic educational background and having all these technical skill sets. But if you can't successfully, integrate that with stakeholder management and just being able to talk to people, it falls on deaf ears. So that being a storyteller is going to be more important than anything, I think, right now. I don't know if you would agree with this, but I see this current market akin to maybe back in 2012, 13, when there was a lot of data warehousing professionals who kind of had to move into the data engineering space to a certain degree and upskill. And the vast majority did do that and became specialists in their own right as well too. I kind of see the market similar right now within the data science and analytics space, where people, all they need to do is just develop and learn some new tools and new technologies and methodologies to upskill themselves within this space to potentially become a new branch of AI specialist. Would you agree with that at all? Is there any holes in that?
No, I think we are at the beginning of, I think calling it an industrial revolution certainly sounds a bit too extreme, but we're certainly at the beginning of a change, right? Like of a step change. So now is without a doubt the time for people to start learning these skills, because it's not like lots of people have them at the moment, and you can get quite a long way with quite a little at the moment. Sort of doing a little bit of training, doing some courses, especially getting some hands-on experience with working on these things. And I think this is where AI for migrations is such an interesting proposition, is there's not many people that have got hands-on experience of actually doing AI projects at the moment. So this is a really interesting way of upskilling both yourself, but from a management perspective as a way of upskilling your team, right? And then hopefully that's going to lead to higher retention as well, because if people are learning on the job and they don't feel like they're stagnating, then hopefully they're going to stick around a bit longer. So I think providing those opportunities to people, like both selfishly, we should all be seeking those opportunities out, because if you don't, you run the very real risk of getting left behind. And from a sort of a leadership position, then likewise, like this is a way of both upskilling your existing talent and then also as a way of attracting new talent. I mean, if I put myself in the shoes of when I left university, for instance, and went and joined Hotels.com as a data scientist, they'd said that I was going to go and work on a migration for 3 years, moving off of a legacy system. I probably wouldn't have thought. I'd have thought that doesn't sound like a very exciting job. Doesn't sound like that's going to give me something to put on my CV to brag about in my next interview, in my next job. However, if that was actually, look, we're trailblazing here. We're trying to do something with this exciting new technology that's not been done before. And, we have the very real possibility of saving millions of pounds and accelerating the delivery of a massive project. Then all of a sudden, that's something that selfishly you're going to think, yeah, this is interesting from an intellectual perspective. It's interesting from a career professional development perspective, because you're going to do something that's quite exciting and quite new. And it's interesting from a business value perspective, because I'm going to be working on something that's attached to a real project, attached to a real value here, rather than something that is just not really delivering anything of any real importance.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on this before as well too on the conversation. Mentioned it just then, even in terms of retention, and I think a lot of organisations, in my opinion, potentially focus on the new and shiny, as opposed to what they've already got, and not been, upskilling. I think is crucial in this current market change. In the next 18 months, you're going to see a lot of movement in the market if organisations don't adopt training within this space, because data people will see they'll see what's going on, and they'll know whether or not it's worth staying. If it's they're all stagnating, then they'll know they'll need to move. It's that simple, really. But just to double down on this as well too, what specific strategies could companies adopt to retain employees during platform migrations, especially as skill sets evolve within Gen AI?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, right? And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that as well, given what you do. But I suppose from a technical perspective and as a techie, then I would be looking at this as what am I going to learn? What am I going to learn through working on this project? Because am I just going to be sat there, turning the wheel? Basically, it's like, right, I know I'm part of a team that's got 10,000 bits of code to move from A to B. We figured out the process, and the next couple of years I can look ahead and I can think, yep, I've basically got a couple of years of maybe safe employment here, but I'm just going to be doing the same thing for the next couple of years. Like that's not exciting. That doesn't make me want to come to work in the morning. And yeah, I might stick at it for a bit, but ultimately I can only see enthusiasm diminishing, effort diminishing, basically everything slowly going down. So for me, it's like, how do you address that problem? How do you keep people engaged and you keep people excited? And I think giving people the ability to learn new stuff is 100% the way to go about that. And Where using AI comes into here is that this is not just giving them a new skill to learn, and then once they've learned it, okay, you're back to where you were. It's not like saying I need you to learn a new language, right? Where, okay, you've learned that, good. Now keep turning that wheel because you've still got a lot of code left to migrate. This needs to be a scalable solution of, okay, this is a research project where, good, you figured something out, apply it to everything. Oh, that's that you learned something that you didn't expect something happened that you didn't expect was going to happen. How are you going to fix that problem? Good, you fixed it, try it again, and then you iterate through it. And this turns it much more from a turning the wheel process into a research project, which is inherently interesting, educational, and I think people are more likely to stick around for.
Yeah, I agree. And from my experience over the last, I say 18 months, specifically within the AI space, let's call it Gen AI space, people, let's just call it data and data science space. People aren't moving because of salary anymore, and that they're not getting an extra whatever on top of that or benefits. Not that they necessarily did previously, but it was probably more of a common reason why people might move. And it's completely fine. What we're finding is that motivations are changing significantly over the last 18 months. People are saying, and echoing what you're saying, I'm not getting the skill set I require in this organization, or I've done it as much as I can here, and there's no plans for migrations into Gen AI or new tool sets or skill sets or use cases in this space. Therefore, I need to take a step out as well too and move there. So that's, in my opinion, for retention, training, 100%. Investing in your own team, making sure they're happy, asking their opinions about what the market is dictating right now, what they're seeing out there, and maybe try and integrate that into your plan as well too. And it's definitely a step-by-step collaborative effort, I think. But we're seeing candidates dropping, honestly, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 pounds off their base salary just to move into an organization that's developing these types of tools and migrations and technologies, because they know that's going to be where it's going to be at in the next 18 months as well too. So definitely agree, and retention is going to be key right now. But like I said earlier, there is, in my opinion, a huge market shift coming for the better as well too.
I think retention, but I think as well, it's for companies that say, especially companies that have like large grad intakes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you go about attracting, traditionally the way that you attract the best talent is you pay the most. Right. Yeah. It's and this is why firms, I guess, consultancies and law firms and whatnot, they pay an absolute fortune for what is basically unproven talent, people fresh out of university. It's insane.
Hedge funds as well are pretty big on that as well too.
Not every firm can compete. Like most firms don't compete that way. You can't hire the best talent when you're competing against. If you're a law firm, for instance, and you're competing against the American firms that are paying like 160, 180k to someone fresh out of university, most firms can't compete with that kind of salary. So you have to compete another way, and the way that you do that, as you just said, is all around going to be what are we going to offer you for your career, for your professional development, outside of just earning loads of money. And some people are always going to take the money, and those people, good luck to them, maybe they'll burn out or something. But those of us that have got, I think those people that are potentially got more of a long-term vision will think I'm probably better off learning some new skills that are going to set me up better for the future than simply just going and chasing the biggest bang for my buck.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely a balance in there as well too, but it's all based on priorities. So, not Rob. I think we're just about to wrap up. I think we're running out of time here. So I really appreciate your insight, knowledge, and opinion today, and expertise within the market, specifically within Gen AI. So thanks again for your time, and appreciate it. We'll hopefully hope to get to talk again soon, the next 12 to 18 months, and I'm sure the market will be completely different then again.
Lovely. Thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Thanks again, buddy. Cheers.